The United States government now spends more money paying interest on its past borrowing than most nations spend to run their entire countries. The principal balance of the national debt is expanding by nearly $100,000 every single second. The headline $39 trillion principal is only half the story. The real pressure comes from the cost to carry that load, $970 billion in annual interest payments. To put that in perspective, this $970 billion interest payment towers over the nation's entire defense or Medicare budgets. It acts like a massive financial vacuum. Today, 19 cents of every tax dollar collected is sliced away just to cover interest. This staggering financial drain is the end result of decades of choices by policymakers and voters alike, choices driven by the specific way our brains perceive time and reward. There is a common myth that governments should budget exactly like a family household. In reality, governments can print their own currency, dictate their tax revenues, and mathematically, they live forever. Because the state lacks the immediate, harsh consequences of a household budget, it easily falls prey to a biological blind spot known as hyperbolic discounting. Hyperbolic discounting is the human brain's evolutionary hardwiring to prefer a small, immediate reward right now over a massive, long-term benefit later. Translate that to modern politics, and the pattern is obvious. Voters and politicians consistently choose the immediate dopamine hit of a tax cut or a stimulus check, delaying the abstract, distant goal of fiscal stability. The towering national debt is the mathematical result of an entire country giving in to its present bias over and over again for decades. Economists call this fiscal illusion. It happens when politicians use borrowed money instead of direct taxes to pay for programs, completely hiding the true cost of those choices from the public. You can track this illusion clearly through recent history. In the early 2000s, unfinanced overseas wars and sweeping tax cuts rapidly drained away the budget surpluses of the late 1990s. By 2017, a new round of tax cuts delivered another immediate economic high to the public, while quietly baking over $1 trillion of unfinanced deficit into the coming decade. Then came the ultimate trigger for present bias, the COVID-19 pandemic. Massive debt-financed stimulus packages injected trillions directly into the economy for immediate relief. This borrowing spree didn't immediately break the system because the Federal Reserve was holding interest rates at zero. That artificial suppression of borrowing costs deepened the fiscal illusion for over a decade. That illusion evaporated in 2022. When surging inflation forced the Federal Reserve to hike rates, the cost to service the government's mountain of short-term debt tripled almost overnight. Decades of treating the national credit card like free money created a psychological mirage of prosperity. Mathematically, it was always destined to shatter the moment interest rates returned to normal. So how does an abstract $39 trillion national problem actively drain your personal bank account? To fund its massive deficits, the government must constantly issue new Treasury bonds, flooding the market and competing directly with the private sector for capital. To attract buyers for all that new debt, the Treasury is forced to raise its yield rates. Because government bonds are considered the safest investment, those higher yields set a much higher baseline interest rate for the entire economy. That federal borrowing pressure translates directly to you. It acts as a hidden surcharge on consumer mortgages, costing a family buying a new home thousands of extra dollars every single year. That invisible tax inflates the annual cost of everyday auto loans, and it chokes the credit lines that small businesses rely on to survive. The government is not a household, but its reckless deficit spending acts as a direct, punitive tax on your household's budget. We have entered a higher-for-longer economic reality. The era of ultra-cheap 3% mortgages and easy credit is permanently over. This chart shows mandatory spending far outstripping investment over the last 50 years. Mandatory debt payments are actively cannibalizing the government's ability to invest in infrastructure, education, and research for the future. To navigate this landscape, individuals have to prepare for higher inflation and probable future tax hikes by diversifying their retirement assets. Resolving a $39 trillion crisis involves a complete reassessment of how we value long-term risk, moving beyond simple adjustments to tax or spending spreadsheets. The bill for our collective present bias has finally come due. As a society, we can no longer afford to discount the future, because the future has finally arrived.